Imagine the largest empire the world has ever seen. Not the Roman Empire, not the British Empire, larger than both. An unbroken stretch of conquered territory running from the shores of the Pacific Ocean across the entire breadth of Central Asia through the heart of Persia and pressing hard against the doorstep of Europe. 33 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface held under a single authority. One empire, one law, one ruling house. Now ask yourself a question. Who held it together? If your mind went immediately to Genghis Khan, you are not wrong, but you are not finished. If your mind went to his generals, his cavalry, his sons, the heirs whose names fill the textbooks and dominate the chronicles, you have been given a story that is technically true and fundamentally incomplete. Because the largest land empire in all of human history was not held together by its sons alone. It was guarded, governed, administered, and in many crucial cases expanded by a group of people whose names you have almost certainly never heard. Women, daughters, the daughters of Genghis Khan. They commanded armies, they governed territories larger than modern nations, they collected tribute from kings who bowed before them, they sat in judgment over disputes that shaped the commerce of continents. They managed the intelligence networks that kept the empire informed across distances so vast that a message from one end to the other could take months to arrive. They protected the trade routes that made medieval globalization possible. And then, across 8 centuries of chronicle writing, court histories, and popular storytelling, their names were quietly, systematically, almost entirely erased. This is the documentary that gives them back. What you are about to hear is not a romantic myth. It is not wishful history or modern projection. It is the careful, documented, painstaking reconstruction of real women who exercised real power in the real medieval world. Power that was enormous, structural, and deliberate, granted to them by the most feared conqueror in human history because he understood, more clearly than most rulers of his age, that competence had no gender and that the empire he was building would need every capable person he could find to hold it together. Their names were Alakai Beki, Chechiyigan, Altun, Tumalun, and others whose names the sources swallowed entirely. Say those names now, because by the time this documentary is finished, you will understand what they cost to forget. The story of Genghis Khan's daughters does not begin with the daughters. It begins with the world that shaped them. And that world in the 12th century was unlike anything that China, Persia, Byzantium, or medieval Europe would have recognized as civilization. The Mongolian steppe, 3 million square kilometers of rolling grassland in the northeastern heart of Asia, a landscape so vast that the horizon feels like a rumor and the sky presses down on everything with a weight that has no name. The wind on the steppe never truly stops. It is the background noise of every life lived there, a constant companion that strips the cold down to the bone in winter and turns the summer into a shimmering, endless shimmer of heat and light. This is not a landscape that forgives weakness. It never has. Life on the steppe in the 12th century was organized not around cities, not around written laws, not around the administrative systems that made sedentary civilizations legible to later historians. It was organized around something older and far more demanding: survival. The people who called this place home were nomadic pastoralists. They followed their herds, sheep, goats, cattle, camels, and above all, horses across the seasonal rhythms of the grassland, moving camp when the grass was eaten down, pitching their portable felt homes called gurs in new locations, assembling and dismantling their entire world in under an hour. Nothing about Mongolian material culture was designed to last. Buildings of stone were not just uncommon, they were a kind of philosophical error. Permanence was vulnerability. A city could be besieged, a fixed settlement could be burned. A people in constant practiced motion were nearly impossible to destroy because they carried everything that mattered with them, and they had been carrying it since before memory. This was a world of clans. Every Mongol was born into a clan, and the clan was the fundamental unit of identity, loyalty, protection, and survival. Clans stood in perpetual shifting relationship with one another, allied through marriage in one generation, enemies through raiding in the next, subordinate to a larger confederation when a sufficiently powerful leader arose, and drifting apart again when that leader died or showed weakness. Power on the steppe was not inherited in any clean or stable sense. It was earned, maintained through continuous demonstration, and lost the moment weakness appeared. A great leader commanded loyalty only as long as he could deliver protection, cattle, and victory. The moment he could not, his followers found a new leader with the same quiet efficiency that water finds a new course. Violence on the steppe was not exceptional, it was structural. Raids between clans were how resources moved: horses, livestock, grain stores, and human beings taken as captives and incorporated into households as servants or slaves. Revenge cycles built up across generations, with a grandfather's death demanding satisfaction that might not come until their grandchildren were old enough to hold a sword. Feuds were the connective tissue of steppe politics, as intimate and constant as weather. And yet, in this world that strikes modern eyes as overwhelmingly, almost exclusively masculine, the warriors on horseback, the blood debts, the iron discipline of the campaign, the position of women was more complex, more substantial, and in some ways more powerful than anywhere else in the medieval world. This is the first thing that surprises people, and it is worth pausing on it. The steppe did not operate by the same patriarchal logic that governed medieval China, the Islamic caliphates, or feudal Europe. There were certainly hierarchies. Men led in war, men held the title of Khan, but the practical reality of nomadic life meant that women were never ornamental. They were essential. When the men rode out on campaign or raid, which happened often and for months at a time, the women did not wait passively for their return. They ran everything. They managed military decisions. They received envoys from neighboring clans. They managed the household economy, which on the steppe was no trivial matter. It meant overseeing herds that represented the family's entire wealth, managing food stores against the brutal possibility of a winter that came early, organizing camp movements across hundreds of kilometers, and directing the labor of servants and subordinates with the authority of commanders. A Mongolian noblewoman of the 12th century could ride a horse as well as any man. She could shoot a bow. She was trained for the physical demands of steppe life from childhood, because steppe life required it. The division of labor was real. Men fought, women managed, but it was a division between two genuinely demanding roles, not between one serious role and one decorative one. This is the soil from which Genghis Khan's daughters would grow. Not anomalies, not exceptions, products of a culture that had always, out of sheer practical necessity, placed enormous trust and responsibility in its women. Born around 1162, somewhere near the Onon River and the northeastern steppe, Temujin entered the world as the son of a minor clan chief. His early life was, by any reasonable measure, catastrophic. When Temujin was roughly 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals from the Tatar tribe. The clan that owed his father loyalty immediately abandoned his family, stranding a widow and her children alone on the steppe in conditions that should have killed them. Temujin was later captured and enslaved by a rival clan, wearing a wooden yoke as a mark of his captivity. His young wife, Borte, was seized in a raid shortly after their marriage and held for months before he managed to recover her. These were not the biographical details of a man with a comfortable relationship to the world. These were the details of a man who had learned, at every level of his being, that survival required ruthlessness, resourcefulness, and a willingness to use every tool available. What happened next is the story the world knows. The gradual, ferocious, methodical rise of a man who was not born to power, but who built it, alliance by alliance, battle by battle, across decades of political maneuvering and military violence. By 1206, the assembled clans of the Mongolian steppe proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, and set in motion a conquest that would transform the medieval world more thoroughly than any other single political event between the fall of Rome and the rise of the European colonial empires. But what concerns us here is not merely what Genghis Khan conquered, it is what he believed, particularly what he believed about capability and about his daughters. Genghis Khan was a man who evaluated people by their usefulness, their competence, and their loyalty, not by their birth and not by their sex. This was not an ideological position, it was a practical one, grown from a lifetime in which birth had not protected him, in which the most reliable people in his life had been the most capable, regardless of where they came from. He selected his generals not from among the old nobility, but from among the men who had demonstrated the ability to win. He incorporated conquered peoples into his administration based on skill, not origin. He was surrounded his entire life by formidable women who shaped everything around them. His mother, Hoelin, had kept her children alive through sheer force of will on a hostile steppe after their clan abandoned them. If Hoelin had been the kind of woman who waited for a man to solve her problems, Temujin would have died in childhood, and there would be no Mongol empire to discuss. His wife, Borte, was a political and strategic partner of the First Order. When she was captured and held by an enemy clan, Temujin did not simply grieve. He mobilized alliances, called in debts, and retrieved her with the full force of his growing network. The partnership between them was not merely sentimental, it was functional. Borte understood power, and Genghis Khan understood that she understood it. His daughter-in-law, Sir Kokhtani Beki, who married his son to Louis, would go on to become one of the most celebrated political minds of the entire Mongol era, a woman whose strategic management of her son's educations and political positioning resulted in all four of them becoming major rulers. Contemporary sources, including Muslim historians who held no particular affection for women in power, described her as extraordinary. She was the product of the same tradition that produced Genghis Khan's daughters. The point is this: Genghis Khan was not a man who wasted assets, and his daughters were assets of extraordinary value. Marriage in the medieval world was statecraft. This was not unique to the Mongols. Dynastic marriage as political alliance was practiced across Eurasia from the Mediterranean to East Asia. Kings gave daughters to seal treaties, emperors gave sisters to cement subordinations. The transaction was universal. But the Mongols deployed it with an unusual sophistication, and Genghis Khan's approach to his daughters' marriages reveals a strategic intelligence that goes far beyond simple alliance building. When Genghis Khan gave a daughter in marriage to a subordinate king or tribal leader, he was doing something that looked on the surface like every other dynastic marriage in history. A powerful ruler binding a lesser one through family connection, a transaction of legitimacy and loyalty sealed by the exchange of a woman. Except that is not what was actually happening. What Genghis Khan was actually doing was deploying a governor, a permanent representative of imperial authority placed directly at the center of a subordinate court, a woman with the full weight of the Mongol Empire behind her who would live in that territory for the rest of her life, watch her husband's behavior, report the condition of the frontier to the imperial center, manage the local administration, collect tribute, protect trade routes, and, in documented cases where the husband proved unreliable or died, take direct control of governance herself. This was the secret that history nearly forgot. The daughters were not prizes in a transaction, they were instruments of governance, and they were selected, placed, and empowered for specific strategic purposes at specific points in the empire's expanding frontier. The mechanism required several things to work. It required daughters who were capable, who understood politics, who could ride, who could command respect, who could navigate the gap between the Mongol imperial world and the local cultures they were sent to govern. It required that the daughters retain their identity as daughters of Genghis Khan, not merely as wives of their husbands. And it required that everyone, the husbands, the local nobles, the merchants, the subordinate chiefs, understood clearly that the woman sitting at the center of the court was not there by sentiment, she was there by imperial design, and her authority was backed by the full force of the most powerful military in the world. Genghis Khan appears to have understood all of this. The marriages of his daughters were not negotiated on a case-by-case basis like commodities. They were strategic placements, as deliberate as the deployment of a general to a critical frontier. His primary wife, Borte, bore him at least 5 daughters whose names survive in the sources: Fian, Chechegan, Alakai Beki, Tumalun, and Altan. Other daughters born to secondary wives likely existed and are largely invisible in the chronicles, a silence that is itself a form of historical argument, which we will return to. Each of the known daughters was placed in a territory that posed a specific administrative challenge. Each of them was chosen not merely because she was available, but because she was the right instrument for a particular problem. Of all Genghis Khan's daughters, Alakai Beki is the one who left the deepest traces in the surviving sources, and her story, once you understand it in full, is one of the most remarkable administrative careers of the entire medieval period. Alakai was given in marriage to the Ongud people, a Turkic group that inhabited the territories just south of the Mongolian steppe in what is now northern China. The Onguds were a strategically critical position. They controlled the approach routes from the steppe into the settled territories of northern China, the passes and river crossings through which any army moving south would have to pass, and along which trade from the nomadic world to the Chinese agricultural heartland flowed in both directions. The Onguds were not merely an alliance, they were a gate. Alakai entered this world not as a passive bride, but as a governor. The title applied to her in contemporary sources is significant. She was called Beki, a term associated in the Mongol world with spiritual and political authority. This was not a courtesy, it was a designation of genuine rank and function. What makes Alakai's story so illuminating is the sheer breadth of what she was asked to do. She managed the Ongud territory as a frontier administration, collecting tribute from the local population, regulating trade across the routes that passed through her territory, maintaining intelligence networks that fed information back to the Mongol imperial center, and managing the relationships between the nomadic world behind her and the settled Chinese agricultural heartland ahead of her. She was doing the work of a diplomat, an administrator, a tax collector, and an intelligence officer simultaneously. And then the situation became more difficult. Alakai's first husband died. This was the moment of vulnerability that her enemies within the Ongud community chose to exploit. A rebellion broke out, a direct challenge to her authority, a test of whether her power was real or ceremonial. In a sedentary empire governed by different principles, the death of a husband might have been the end of a woman's political career. She would have returned to her father's court, or remarried into subordination, or simply faded from the record. Alakai did none of these things. She suppressed the rebellion, directly, decisively, using the military forces at her disposal. The speed and confidence of her response speaks to a woman who was neither surprised by the challenge nor uncertain of what to do about it. She then remarried, continuing the political logic of her position, and continued governing the Ongud territory for years, appearing in the sources well into the 2030s, decades after Genghis Khan himself died in 2027.
The administrative infrastructure she built in the Ongud territory was not dismantled when she eventually left the historical record. It continued to function. The governance models she developed, the relationships she cultivated between the nomadic Mongol system and the Chinese bureaucratic tradition, the hybrid administration she created, all of it had durability. It shaped how the region was governed for generations after her death. Alakai Beki was a governor, a real one, with real power, real problems, and a real record of solving them. East of the Ongud territory, across the vast grasslands stretching toward Manchuria and the Korean peninsula, the Mongol Empire needed to manage a network of smaller kingdoms in tribal confederations whose loyalty was essential to the empire's eastern flank. It is here that another of Genghis Khan's daughters enters the story. Cheche Igen was married to Tural, a prince of the Oirat people, a powerful tribal confederation in the western Mongolian region that had submitted to Genghis Khan during the Great Unification of the steppe clans. The Oirat alliance was important not merely for the warriors it provided, but for the geographic access it granted. The Oirat homeland served as a bridge between the Mongolian heartland and the regions further west and north, where the empire's expanding frontier required constant management. What is most revealing about Cheche Igen's story is not her marriage, but the role she played within it. She appears in historical sources not as a passive wife, but as a political actor in her own right, a woman who understood the network she was embedded in and used it actively. The daughters functioned as an intelligence service. This is not a metaphor. They sent regular communications, dictated or written since literacy was not universal on the steppe, to the imperial center, describing the condition of their territories, the loyalty of local chiefs, the state of the trade routes, the mood of the population, the behavior of neighboring rulers. They were Genghis Khan's eyes and ears at the empire's frontiers, operating in real time across distances that would otherwise have made coordinated governance nearly impossible. Consider what this meant in practical terms. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched roughly 8,000 kilometers from east to west. A message on horseback traveling the relay station system that the Mongols established across the empire could cover extraordinary distances in a matter of weeks. But the message only carried useful information if someone at the other end knew what to look for, understood the political landscape well enough to identify what was significant, and had the authority and judgment to decide what needed to be reported. That was the daughters. They were not passive conduits. They were analysts. Cheche-Egan's territory and the territories of daughters like her also served as logistical nodes in the Mongol military system. The extraordinary mobility of Mongol armies, the quality that made them nearly unstoppable in the field, depended on supply networks that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Fresh horses, food supplies, intelligence about what lay ahead, all of this had to be available at regular intervals along the route of any major campaign. The territories governed by royal daughters were positioned to provide exactly this support. They were not just administrative centers, they were strategic assets in the Mongol military system. Cheche-Egan's presence in her territory communicated something every single day through her very existence, that the Khan was watching, that the empire was not an abstraction, but a living authority with a face and a name sitting at the center of local power. The daughters were, in their own persons, the most personal and direct expression of imperial presence that the Mongol system had. No bureaucratic communication, however efficient, carried the weight of a daughter of Genghis Khan in the room. The third great frontier to manage was to the west, where the Mongol Empire's expanding reach pressed against the territories of the Uyghur Kingdom, and it is here that the daughter story takes its most intellectually interesting turn. The Uyghurs were not merely a military asset, they were a civilization. They had a writing system, they had a tradition of administration and record-keeping refined over generations. They had Buddhist monasteries, urban centers, a merchant class engaged in long-distance trade, and an administrative culture whose sophistication the Mongols recognized immediately and needed urgently. When the Uyghurs submitted to Genghis Khan, they brought with them something the Mongols desperately lacked: the bureaucratic infrastructure to govern a continental empire. The Uyghur script was adopted by the Mongols as their primary writing system. Uyghur administrators became some of the most important officials in the early Mongol imperial government, creating the written records, tax systems, and communication networks that allowed an empire of this scale to actually function. Without the Uyghur administrative contribution, the Mongol Empire would have been a military phenomenon without the governmental machinery to consolidate what it conquered. Into this world, Genghis Khan sent Altan. Altan's role was different from her sisters. Alakai faced a frontier that needed military discipline and political suppression. Cheche-Egan managed an intelligence network across the eastern steppe. Altan was tasked with something more delicate: managing the integration of an existing, sophisticated bureaucracy into the Mongol imperial system without destroying the administrative capacity that made it valuable. This required a different kind of intelligence, not the warrior's instinct for the moment of decision that Alakai demonstrated when she suppressed the rebellion, not the strategic clarity that Cheche-Egan brought to her intelligence role. What Altan needed was the diplomat's patience, the administrator's attention to the machinery of governance, and the cultural sensitivity to understand that the Uyghurs were not simply conquered people to be subordinated, but a resource to be preserved and integrated. The evidence from the sources suggests she was equal to the challenge. The Uyghur territories remained stable and productive through the early decades of Mongol expansion. The administrative system continued to function. The supply of Uyghur officials to the imperial bureaucracy continued without disruption. This stability was not automatic. Conquered peoples resist.
bureaucracies resist change. The integration of a sedentary administrative tradition into a nomadic imperial system is a genuinely difficult problem, and Altan was at the center of solving it. Altan's territory and the territories of daughters like her also served as logistical nodes in the Mongol military system. The Uyghur territory was one of the great commercial crossroads of the medieval world, a place where goods moving between East Asia and the Mediterranean passed through, were taxed, stored, and redirected. Protecting this trade was one of the foundational economic priorities of the Mongol Empire, and Altan, sitting at its center, was among the most economically powerful individuals in the medieval world. Not every daughter left the same depth of trace in the surviving sources, and the story of those whose records are thinner is in its own way as important as the stories of those who are more visible. Tumalin is among the daughters whose story is harder to reconstruct. What the sources tell us is limited. She appears in genealogical records as a daughter of Borte, which places her among the recognized royal children. She was married into a strategic alliance. Beyond these skeletal facts, the details record thins. This thinness is itself a document, not of her insignificance, but of the priorities of the people doing the recording. The daughters who governed large, stable, commercially active territories generated records because their administrations generated records, tax ledgers, trade inventories, correspondence with the imperial center, disputes adjudicated and set down in writing. The more active and productive a territory, the more paper it produced and the more traces it left for later historians to find. The daughters whose territories were smaller, more peripheral, or whose political activity fell into the hands of chroniclers who were less interested in female governance left lighter footprints. This does not mean they did less. It means the recording of history is itself a political act, shaped by the priorities and assumptions of the people doing it. Genghis Khan almost certainly had more daughters than the 5 whose names appear in the surviving sources. The daughters born to secondary wives are largely invisible in the chronicles, not because they were important, but because the chroniclers who wrote those chronicles were writing about the main lineage, the sons of Borte, the heirs whose succession mattered to the political narrative being constructed. Daughters who existed at the margins of the genealogical record existed at the margins of the historical record too, even when their political roles were real and substantial. There are daughters whose names are gone entirely, women whose marriages created alliances that subsequent events rendered irrelevant and therefore uninteresting to later chroniclers who had no reason to record what no longer mattered politically. Women whose territories were absorbed into larger administrative units, whose individual traces dissolved into institutional records that did not preserve individual attribution. They were there. Their political function was real. Their erasure is a product not of their insignificance, but of the silence that accumulates around the unstudied and unrecorded. We cannot give back their names because we don't have them. What we can do is acknowledge the shape of their absence, the structural gap in the record where a pattern of female governance clearly existed, but where the specific individuals have been lost. That gap is itself a form of historical evidence about the scale of what the daughters actually were. To understand what the daughters governed, you need to understand what they were governing for. And the answer, beyond the military and political dimensions, is this: they were governing for trade, for the greatest commercial network the medieval world had ever seen. By the mid-12th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to Persia. Across this vast territory ran the arteries of the Silk Road, not a single road, but a web of routes, some ancient and well-traveled, some newer and more contingent, through which the goods of the medieval world moved in both directions: silk and porcelain from China, spices and cotton from South India, Persian metalwork and glass, European silver and wool, horses from the steppe, ivory, amber, furs. And with the goods moved ideas, technologies, religions, medical knowledge, mathematical systems, agricultural techniques, stories. Before the Mongols, the Silk Road was interrupted constantly. Political instability, raiding, the absence of any authority capable of guaranteeing safety across the borders between different kingdoms and empires.
Merchants faced extortion at every crossing, robbery in the gaps between protected zones, and the perpetual danger of passing through territories where no consistent law applied. The Mongol Empire changed this. The system known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, made it possible for roughly a century to travel the entire length of Eurasia under the protection of a single political authority. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo made the journey. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta made versions of it. Ambassadors, missionaries, and commercial agents moved back and forth across the continent in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy. The Mongols understood with remarkable clarity for a society that had begun as steppe nomads with no tradition of urban commerce, that trade generated wealth, and wealth fueled empire. Merchants were to be protected, not preyed upon. The routes were to be maintained. The relay station system, the YAM, that the Mongols established across the empire was simultaneously a military communication network and a commercial infrastructure, allowing goods and information to move at speeds that were genuinely revolutionary by medieval standards. The daughters were central to this system, not incidentally, structurally. Alakai's governance of the Ongood territory controlled the approaches to northern China from the steppe, the routes along which Chinese goods moved outward and foreign goods moved in. Altun's position in the Uyghur kingdom placed her at the heart of Central Asian commercial geography. The western frontier daughters managed territories through which goods moved between Persia, the steppe, and Russia. They collected taxes on this trade. They provided security. And security was worth more than low taxes to any merchant who had traveled the routes before the Pax Mongolica. A caravan moving through a territory administered by a daughter of Genghis Khan was traveling under the protection of the most powerful military force in the world. Raiding that caravan was not a commercial crime. It was an act of war against the empire itself, with all the consequences that implied. The daughters enforced this understanding. They were not passive administrators who simply collected tariffs. They maintained order actively, punishing bandits, disciplining local chiefs who failed to protect merchants, responding to complaints with the authority of the imperial center behind them. The orderly, commercially open territory was not a byproduct of their presence. It was the point of their presence. The wealth that flowed through the Silk Road during the Pax Mongolica was staggering by medieval standards. The daughters of Genghis Khan were, in purely economic terms, among the most powerful individuals in the world. It would be a mistake to understand the daughters purely as administrators and diplomats, because the steppe world that made them was, at its core, a military world, and they were products of that world in every dimension. Several of Genghis Khan's daughters commanded military forces directly. This should not be understood as exceptional by Mongol standards. The empire's military system was organized by decimal units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, and command was assigned by demonstrated capability and by the rank of the commander, not by gender. A noblewoman of sufficient rank and demonstrated competence could and did exercise military command. The tradition of Mongol women as warriors was not merely legendary, it was documented. Alakai's suppression of the Ongood rebellion is the most clearly attested instance. When the internal challenge came following her first husband's death, she responded with the military forces at her disposal. The decisiveness of that response tells us something important. She was not improvising. She had access to troops, she understood how to deploy them, and she made the decision to use them without hesitation. These are not the behaviors of a woman encountering military authority for the first time. They are the behaviors of a woman who had exercised it before and knew what she was doing. More broadly, the daughters exercised what might be called strategic military authority, the power to mobilize forces, direct campaigns, and deploy violence in support of imperial objectives.
When Mongol armies moved through a region, the royal daughters and adjacent territories served as logistical anchors, providing supplies, intelligence, fresh horses, remounts, and the local knowledge that could mean the difference between a campaign that succeeded and one that stalled in unfamiliar terrain. The extraordinary mobility that was the Mongol army's greatest military asset depended on this kind of support infrastructure, and the daughters were among the most reliable providers of it. There are passages in the sources that describe daughters riding armed into conflict themselves. These accounts require careful handling. They may reflect documentary reality or the literary conventions of cultures that found such images memorable and powerful. But even reading them conservatively, they speak to a world in which the daughters were understood as martial figures backed by force, and in which everyone around them understood this. Their authority was not merely administrative, it was grounded in the ultimate Mongol currency, the credible capacity for violence. The contrast with women in the sedentary empires of the same era is startling enough to be startling. In Song Dynasty China, in Abbasid Baghdad, in medieval France, a woman who commanded troops was a sensational anomaly that demanded special explanation, a saint, a miracle, an exception, a story that broke the rules so dramatically that people remembered it for centuries precisely because it was so unique. On the Mongol steppe and in the empire it created, it was simply part of the toolkit of governance, one instrument among many, used when the situation required it. To understand what governing the Mongol Empire actually required, you need to set aside every assumption drawn from the administrative traditions of sedentary civilizations. The Mongol Empire was not Rome, it was not the Tang Dynasty, it was not the Abbasid Caliphate. It did not have a professional civil service recruited through examination, or a legal tradition codified in textbooks, or an architectural tradition of government buildings that imposed physical order on the territories being governed. What it had was something simpler and more demanding: the authority of the Chinggisid line, backed by military force, communicated through personal representatives, and enforced through a combination of direct presence and the credible threat of overwhelming violence. The daughters were personal representatives of the highest possible order, not bureaucrats carrying imperial authority on paper, not officials whose legitimacy derived from appointment and could be revoked by a subsequent appointment. They were daughters. The blood connection was indelible, and in a political system that organized everything around kinship and loyalty, blood was the most powerful legitimating force available. The practical work of governance in their territories was enormously varied. They presided over dispute resolution, the adjudication of conflicts between local nobles, between merchants and local authorities, between neighboring communities with competing claims over resources. They managed the tribute collection system, determining what was owed, when it was due, and how it would be assessed, decisions that had immediate and concrete consequences for everyone in their territory. They maintained the relay station network. The YAM that the Mongols established across the empire was simultaneously a military communication network and a commercial infrastructure, allowing goods and information to move at speeds that were genuinely revolutionary by medieval standards. The spiritual landscape of their territories was, in the syncretic, pragmatic Mongol imperial system, managed relationships with Buddhist monasteries, Nestorian Christian communities, shamanism traditions, and, in the Western territories, Muslim populations, all of which required different approaches and different kinds of respect. Alakai's territory was also a zone of cultural encounter between the nomadic Mongol world and the settled Chinese civilization. She had to operate simultaneously in the political logic of the steppe, where authority was personal, where loyalty was won, where power was demonstrated through martial competence, and in the administrative logic of Chinese governance, where bureaucratic documentation mattered, where the relationships with Confucian officials required a different kind of diplomacy, where the written record was fundamental to legitimacy. Managing this interface was a form of cultural translation that required extraordinary sophistication. The daughters were not doing any of this with extensive institutional support. They were doing it with their own judgment, their own intelligence networks, the military forces at their disposal, and the authority conferred by being who they were. The fact that the territories they governed were in the main stable and productive is the most powerful testimony available to their competence. To understand what governing the Mongol Empire actually required, you need to set aside every assumption drawn from the administrative traditions of sedentary civilizations. The Mongol Empire was not Rome, it was not the Tang dynasty, it was not the Abbasid Caliphate.